Good afternoon, good morning. I would like to welcome you from the Cities Alliance Secretariat to this webinar. We have unmuted the guests. We saw we have already several guests connecting and our speakers also online, just testing the techniques, but I think it should work. So on behalf of the Cities Alliance Secretariat, we are happy and to welcome you to this webinar today on infrastructure investment planning and equitable economic growth. The series has been inaugurated by the joint work program Equitable Economic Growth in Cities, which is shared by the UK Department of International Development, DFID. And as a global learning and piloting program, this joint work program seeks to better understand the link between public service provision and equitable economic growth. So actually the question, what advice can we give to a mayor of a secondary city if she wants to foster the productivity of the informal sector, as well as to increase the access to public services so that citizens can increase the participation in the labor market. So that's actually the challenge what the joint work program has given and is working towards. And against this background, we're delighted to organize this webinar today, whose focus is, as I mentioned, infrastructure investment planning in cities. So understanding what investment needs to be made to provide and renew infrastructure and services as an important aspect to enhance growth potential in cities. So before we start, I just want to present our panelists today. So we have Ian Palmer with us here as an adjunct professor. He's working at the African Center for Cities, the University of Cape Town, a long-standing partner of the Cities Alliance. We have with us as well Adrian Peters, who is the Chief Strategic Officer of eThekwini Municipality of Durban, and Rajivan Krishnaswamy, a senior municipal finance expert, also a long-standing expert and friend of the Cities Alliance, and working very closely within this joint work program on equitable economic growth. My name is Marie-Alexandra Kurth. I work at the Cities Alliance Secretariat. I'm a senior urban specialist. I'm here in Brussels at the Secretariat, and I'm going to moderate this session today. And just some technicalities before we start. We have, I hope you received the program. We have 45 minutes approximately. We will have the presentation from Ian Palmer first, which will last approximately 20 minutes. And then afterwards, we will have two commentaries, one by Adrian Peters and the other by Rajivan. We will encourage you to provide questions if possible. You have two options. I hope it works today. So you see in the WebEx when you connected on the right side, you have a window where you can type your questions. And if it's too complicated or you're connecting by phone, please also feel free to send me emails. I will just give you my email. It's mkurth, so M from Marie, KURTH @citiesalliance.org in case you have questions. So without further, I would like to welcome once again Ian Palmer to the webinar. Ian, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you first of all for the opportunity to talk about this topic, which is a topic that's very dear to my heart. And thank you to the other panelists for being here. The focus is going to be on infrastructure investment planning, but clearly I would like to link it to the importance for economic growth and particularly for equitable access to services. I'm going to start off with why you would do investment planning or infrastructure investment planning. It's a background slide. It's mostly we realize the importance of the economy of cities and the role that infrastructure, urban infrastructure brings us in terms of serving citizens and enterprises or businesses. We know that cities in the global south are facing rapid growth with associated need for large-scale expansion of urban infrastructure, and understanding what investments need to be made to provide and renew this infrastructure and what this means for the viability of urban services against the growth potential of cities is clearly important. And I need to emphasize here, we're talking about viability under a situation where we talk, including social equity. In other words, we're looking at urban services for all citizens and businesses and enterprises. This is the realm of infrastructure investment planning, with the emphasis on capital costs of urban infrastructure over a period of, say, 20 years, how these investments will be financed, how this impacts on the operating account, and hence the ongoing viability of a municipality in the sense that it can cover its operating costs and revenue, and also how this has environmental impacts, what resources are required and what waste is produced. Then this is a complex set of relationships, and we are arguing here for the use of a model as planning. We're looking at the relationships between service levels, capital operating costs, use of resources, revenue, and capital finance. It's also necessary to understand these relationships over time in order to make plans. And the model allows these relationships to be analyzed and for projections to be made in the future. And I'm also going to talk through some of the key features of this type of analysis. I'm talking from a South African perspective here, as this type of modeling has been applied over the past 20 years, with the most widely applied model being the Municipal Services Financial Model, which is the focus of this presentation. This model was developed largely with assistance from the Development Bank of Southern Africa, National Treasury of the Government of Southern Africa, and I would like to say that eThekwini Municipality had a big hand in, let's say, championing this and helping develop the modeling, and I'll come back to eThekwini. This is a slide that just gives you an overview of the key features of the Municipal Services Finance Model. On the right, these different blue boxes show you the services that it can assesses. It assesses the overheads, if you like, the governance and administration, the roles of a local authority in developing, facilitating development and regulating businesses, for example. These are non-service functions. And then the service functions, first of all, the publicly accessed services, health, security, emergency, and community services. Roads being a key element of infrastructure. And then we get what in South Africa are called trading services, or services which you can run as a business, which includes water and sanitation, electricity, and solid waste services. Now, each of these services are required, obviously, for either a household to function or a business to function. So the model does link to housing as a driver of the provision of infrastructure. You can downplay that if you do need to, but if you want to run it as part of a housing program, you can. And currently, it does not deal with public transport, but key public transport information can be drawn into the cells, as can other capital expenditure, but in this case, it would literally be lines of potential costs and finance. The way the model works, key features of it are summarized here. It's developed in Excel format. It can be run by services provided by a local authority only, but more usefully allows for all urban services to be modeled regardless of the service provider. It provides for 4 different settlement types, which you can free format, typically urban formal, informal settlements, traditional rural settlements, and formal farming areas would be an example. It requires a starting position with regard to existing services, current year financials, and current resource balances. So you need a water balance, for example, and an energy balance as your starting point. Then from that starting point, you can make projections, and clearly this needs to be driven by economic growth, demographic growth, and your service level strategy, what type of servicing you are wanting to analyze. Most importantly, obviously, once considering viability, is the affordability needs to be tested. And affordability is a primary concern for households, and what households' bills need to be paid for all urban services, and that includes the local authority taxes and fees. So this is quite important because quite often households are billed by various service providers, and it's important to look at the household bills in aggregate for all service providers. The structure of the model is shown in the slide, starting from the existing situation, as I mentioned. What is the consumer profile? What are the existing service levels? And what are the existing assets that are in place, existing infrastructure assets? Then one makes projections based on economic growth and household growth, what service options you would like to test, what are the resource-related options, and how much, what limitations you're going to place on the use of water and energy, and how much emphasis you're going to place on rehabilitation of assets or renewal versus new assets. Obviously, when you're looking at service options in this case, you want to look at service options across the spectrum from the poorest households to the biggest businesses. It is important to understand the impact on physical resources, use of water and energy particularly, and the model also allows you to generate waste stream, wastewater generated and solid waste generated. And finally, obviously, it's a financial model, so it needs to look at what the capital expenditure projections will be. This is largely driven by unit costs, and having good cost information is important. What are the operating expenditure implications as you carry on forward? Where are you getting capital from, source of capital, and where are you raising your operating revenue from? All of that comes together in a sustainability assessment. Can you cover operating costs and capital costs with these various finance sources? It's important to consider the nature of service providers. In South Africa, the situation with multiple service providers is relatively easy, as cities provide most of the services themselves. As you'll see when we look at the example, cities provide a complete package of services, and eThekwini being the best example of that, actually. But the model, the MSFM, does allow for multiple service providers, so you can model a situation where the electricity is provided by a national provider, national SOE, very typical in African countries, and water is quite often provided by a corporatized entity at local scale, or it could be a regional entity. We're running it currently for Kisumu in Kenya, looking at this situation where there are multiple service providers. It does need some adaptation if you have separate financing strategies for each of these service providers. Often it becomes more complicated. So moving on to an example, and as you'll see here, we're using the city of eThekwini, which is centered on Durban. So most people would know it as Durban rather than eThekwini. And the reason for choosing this is twofold. First of all, as I've mentioned, eThekwini has been a supporter of the evolution of this model. And secondly, it is the place where it's been applied in most depth, and Adrian will be able to give you some sense of it when he talks later in this session. This is slightly old data because we are going back to the analysis and runs we did in 2012. The consumer profile is clearly important, and this diagram shows what can happen in over a 10-year period. The model deals with low-income indigent households, which in a sense in South Africa are households who are deemed to be able to pay very little, low-income residential consumers and high-income residential consumers. Plus, at the very top, you'd also have non-residential consumer units. And each of these has a different financial strategy. So in South Africa, indigents get free services, free basic services. But you can, if you don't have free services, you can set higher levels at higher levels of bills based on affordability criteria. In the middle group, bills are set based on affordability, and in the high income group, there's a potential for cross subsidy to be estimated. How much cross subsidy would you expect to generate from this higher group? And as you can imagine, the balance as you get a poorer and poorer city, the financial sustainability issues change a lot in terms of having less wealthier consumers versus poorer consumers. Projecting forward on use of resources is important, as you can see in the slide, what proportion of water, first of all, is going to be used by low-income residential households, high-income residential households, non-residential households, and then what are the real or technical losses. So where is the water going to? And again, as you can see, for a middle-income country, low-income residential households use a relatively small proportion of the water. Similarly with electricity, you can project forward. Most notably here, the most obvious thing is a high level of consumption by non-residential consumers in the eThekwini, and that's very typical for other South African cities. And it's a big gain for the cities because electricity is a viable, generally a very viable service. You can generate surpluses from it, and particularly where you've got a large proportion of non-residential sales, generate significant surpluses. There are, incidentally, these projections also for solid waste and wastewater. So turning to the financial results, here is a projection of an operating expenditure. Keep in mind that this is for all service providers. So if you take electricity, for example, in the case of eThekwini, this electricity is supplied by the municipality itself, but if it was supplied by an external provider, the model will still calculate its costs. So you can see the cost trends with regard to water, sanitation, electricity, solid waste, roads, public services, which in South Africa includes community services, parks, libraries, public safety, and some primary health care. JWP, which is the governance, administration, planning, and development facilitation activities, say your overheads, your sort of facilitation costs, and various other minor costs. And obviously, looking at these graphs, electricity costs are dominant, and largely those costs are the purchase of bulk electricity, and in South Africa's case from the national utility being Eskom. Operating revenue, here, this is the picture for eThekwini, and you could see the dominance of user charges, of which electricity charges would in turn be dominant. So mostly it's raised revenue through tariffs. Really importantly, in South African cities, the substantial amount raised through property rates, which is the purple on this graph. They also are opted for other levies and other internal revenue fines, for example, would be one. And one of the critical issues in other African cities is how can you, as one would, people who work in the field would know, how can you get to this point where substantial amounts of funding is generated for property rates particularly. In South Africa, the operating grants and subsidies is relatively small, as you can see, so the cities are largely financially autonomous, not very dependent on transfers from national government. The picture, if you could compare operating and costs and revenue, is that in this run, eThekwini had a deficit in its operating account, a small one, but the modelling showed it declining. It uses surpluses from trading services, electricity particularly, into consideration, so surpluses would go into funding other services, and just note again the low reliance on transfers. Capital expenditure projection. I won't go into detail of why the shape of total capital expenditure looks like that. It's largely because of the way targets are set in the model. So targets would have been set to get rid of backlogs, for example, in the first 4 years, and after that the requirement for capital drops off, but then will then grow as the economy grows. So you can see a projection on the spectrum of services: water, sanitation, electricity, solid waste, roads, public services, public transport, public places, economic infrastructure and buildings, maybe convention centres, for example, and then administrative buildings and systems, which is the city's own buildings, IT systems, and so on. What's important in this type of modelling, even for quite economically strong cities such as eThekwini, is they seldom have sufficient capital. So these diamonds on the first 3 bars show you what eThekwini's actual capital budget was in those years. And so, in other words, there was a deficit over the ideal. And the deficit generally leads to an inability to properly fund informal settlements and asset renewal. Mostly in these type of cities, the money is almost always allocated to economically stronger settlements in the cities, to high-income residential developments, to commercial and industrial developments. Mostly what lags is access of capital for informal settlements and poor people. Hence the importance of understanding what's going on and making sure funding is properly allocated for settlements where poor people are living. Capital finance. This is obviously the same totals as you saw in the previous graph. And how is this investment going to be funded? The bottom three parts of the bar, red, light blue, and dark blue, are subsidies, housing subsidies, which can be used to fund internal infrastructure. The Municipal Infrastructure Grant, MIG, and then a range of other grants and subsidies, with public transport subsidies being a substantial component of this, and various other grants that are transferred from the national fiscus. What's important in South Africa, certainly in terms of the future, is the role of development charges, which is funds provided by property developers of high and middle income developments for funding infrastructure. Use of internal reserves, which is surpluses generated by a city, which can be reinvested back into infrastructure, and borrowing. And you can see that in this model run, there still remained an infrastructure funding gap, which is typical. It's very hard to close this gap completely. And we have looked at options of borrowing more, for example. So I'm coming to conclusion here. What can you do with this type of modeling? First of all, you can use the planning tool for an individual municipality, which is what I've been focusing on. Secondly, you can run it at a national level as a policy benchmarking or regulatory tool for applying comparative assessments of municipalities. So National Treasury has done this quite extensively in South Africa, run this model for all the cities, for example, which they did in 2017. How they compare and how cities can share information. You can use it to develop a national municipal services investment framework, which has also been done in South Africa. So you can look at the totality of investment for all municipalities subdivided into different groups. You can use it for only individual services, as we've done in Zambia, for only water and sanitation and for water companies there. And you can use it to assess the impact of economic growth on the demand for services, which is clearly important given the overall topic of this webinar. So better investment leads to a better economy, and you have this virtual cycle. Better infrastructure, improved economic growth, improved household income, greater willingness to pay, more money into your account, better infrastructure. And obviously, as you are increasing economic growth, you get increased access to finance. Ideally, one should look at this probably broken down into different consumer groups, but what the key agenda is for today is how do you make sure that better infrastructure also serves poor people, that they benefit from the economic growth, and that they also become willing to pay. So finally, sound planning for infrastructure investment brings three primary benefits. It balances the use of financial resources between infrastructure for citizens, with the emphasis on poor citizens and enterprises. It tests the affordability of service provision programs and associated service levels, taking grants and cross-subsidies into consideration. And ultimately, this type of planning assesses the financial sustainability and relates this to efficient use of resources with maximum social benefit being the key objective. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and I hope we can have some useful discussion.
Yeah, and thank you very much for the presentation, for the comprehensive presentation. As I mentioned from the beginning, we will have now two commentaries from Adrian Peters and then afterwards Rajivan, and afterwards I will then open up for questions. I encourage everybody to use the chat we're already receiving some questions from the audience, so please feel free to send us the questions. I would now give the floor to Adrian Peters, who is the Chief Secretary Officer of the City of eThekwini from Durban, who has apparently already experience with this Municipal Service Finance Model, just to inform us how he has been working with this model, and maybe also to provide some feedback on the current situation and how the model is also fostering or has a link to equitable economic growth in his city.
Thank you, Marie. Good day to everyone, wherever you are. Just a few points from my side. I think that globally, there's a lot of discussion about leadership, and often the discussions about leadership relates to how decisions are made, decision making. And obviously, in order to deal with objective and effective decision making, tools become important, especially when you have a very complex environment. So tools, especially when you're looking into the future and where you're dealing with uncertainty and complex relationships, these tools are there to assist us. And the MSFM tool is one such tool which we in eThekwini have seen as being quite important to improve the level of decision making that happens within the city. Generally, in the city, there's often a tussle between what we would call revenue absorbing demands versus revenue generating demands and revenue sustaining demands. And often politically, there's a desire to deal with the revenue absorbing functions, which are often the functions that relate to social issues and things that that deal with the poor and that are often close to people's hearts. But the importance of trying to address those revenue absorbing or those social related spend is the need to make sure that the municipality is viable in the long term. There's no point in dealing with backlogs to services as the model, the one example that was shown. There's no point in dealing with that at an accelerated pace, only to find that the municipality is then bankrupt in 5 to 6 years. The role of municipalities is to provide an ongoing service, and so we've got to make sure that we are generating enough revenue so that we are able to deal with those social functions that are revenue absorbing in nature. Whilst politically there's often a desire to champion things like backlogs, there's obviously a need to make sure that we deal with viability. So when we use the MSFM model as an example, we wanted to get a good sense of what would happen if we accelerated our response to backlogs, basic service backlogs, things that are really essential to communities and people who don't have services. And one of the results was that we would in fact end up bankrupting the city in the medium term. And so we needed to make sure that we had a careful balance between our expenditure and our investments in developments that bring in revenue to the city, so that we can in fact respond effectively and sustainably to the need for basic services. Obviously, our economic growth strategies, we wanted to also get a sense of how can we deal with backlogs if we pursue investments that grow the economy. It's not just the provision of infrastructure often that deals with eliminating a backlog. If you are able to raise the income group of people that live in your city, they also then move out of that indigent range that Ian spoke about. And so you can actually start to address your backlog, not just by providing those services to people who don't have the backlog, but increasing the income levels of people who at this stage probably don't have any income. So we've used the tool to model that, to give us a good sense of what's the best balance between investments that grow the economy versus investments that respond directly to the basic service needs that people have. So the MSFM, just in summary, we've developed a hierarchy of tools that we use to assist our decision making. The MSFM often at the outset gives us a good sense of how much we should be spending so that we've got the right balance. We know that over a 10-year period at least that we're financially viable. Then we've got tools that help us to look at what should we be spending on, where should we be investing, how much should we be investing, etc. So we find the tool very useful because at least at the highest level, it helps us to defend and provide objective information to decision makers on what's the most sustainable strategy moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for giving your perspective from your city and actually also how you're using the tool, how useful the tool is, and how you're also linking it to economic growth. With this, I would like to hand over to Rajivan to also give us some reflections on the presentation, but maybe also what we have heard from Adrian. Rajivan knows this model, but knows several different models which exist, and might also have some questions which can start our conversation afterwards. Rajivan, over to you.
There are two ways in which this presentation has been really useful because it just shows a commonality of themes across the world. What I mean is that models such as this are being used in secondary cities in Asia and in certain parts of Latin America. What they really do is make decision-making fact-based, not just, waving hands in the air. And specifically, there are two aspects of this kind of modeling which are really worth picking up on and expanding its scope. The first is that I have personally seen that mayors at the city level with models like this are able to introduce heck of a lot of transparency in decision making. You take a small town and say, should tariffs be $100 or $150? What are the effects on the cash flow? These are things which instead of talking through the air, if you're able to demonstrate it through models, there's heck of a lot more citizen participation and agreement. This is one thing which is really good about this. It improves governance as a whole and improves transparency as a whole. That's one real good upshot of this kind of modeling everywhere across the world. The second upshot, which is personally I think is really more valuable, is equally valuable, is that all of us know that given the state of infrastructure deficits or backlogs, that there's going to be cities in the developing world are going to be pretty sad in terms of access to these kinds of basic services at a city level, and certainly within cities from the point of view of neighborhoods which are more challenged than others. And therefore, to get to scale, you need borrowing. So the second aspect of why this kind of modeling is really good is that it allows finance, people who can lend money, to look at eThekwini or Joburg or Calcutta or Mumbai or Rio and understand what kind of money can go in and, more importantly, what kind of money can repay. So from these two broad macro perspectives, one of encouraging transparency within the city, enabling the mayor to communicate with his citizens on a fact-based policy kind of model rather than talking in the air. And secondly, from the point of view of lenders and finance, which really needs to flow into these cities, this kind of modeling is really good. So that's at a macro level. Now, there's 3 or 4 questions, which this is a very interesting presentation. And thank you, Ian, and thank you, Adrian, because this comes from applying these models in other kinds of places. Basically, the first question is how disaggregated can you get? Can you really look at it ward-wise? Can you split it ward-wise? Can you see which wards are really worse off? What kinds of money comes in from which ward? I don't know what ward's the correct structure of governance elsewhere. But the point is basically how disaggregated can you get at the city level? The second is how well does it separate into modules? Because if you're looking at secondary cities in many places, the functional allocation of responsibility is pretty thin. Water, sanitation, many of these stuff are national level utilities. So can you really separate these modules and then, push them back? Because the control over financing or budgeting of these kinds of services are not within the purview of most of the secondary cities, which we've been looking at under this JWP, both in Bangladesh and in Ghana. In Uganda, many of these services are out of the scope and are with national level utilities. So the first question is, one, how disaggregated do you get and at the city level? And second question, as an upshot, is can you handle multiple service providers with different kinds of financing backgrounds? Because the water company in Mabale or Gulu, which is owned by the national government, may have an entirely different budget, which doesn't fit into the cities. The second is more a technical point that using these models, how accurate do you really get? Because I don't know about South Africa, but my understanding is that many of the revenues and expenditures are on cash basis. So we really don't know, what are the amounts due and amounts payable. Many municipalities, when you do this kind of modeling, don't pay certain dues like pension to their teachers who retired, or they don't pay for their electricity dues where they buy electricity from outside. So these don't get reflected in the accounts. So there's been a usual challenge in accommodating cash versus accrual accounting in these kinds of financial statements. That's on the accuracy part. Then the third part is really on the means of finance. How flexible can you really get with this modeling in terms of, the sensitivities of, I understand from the eThekwini example that even capital grants appear fairly limited from national government, but in many of the other cities, the ratio of capital grants to capital expenditure be way over 60-70%. In which case, how well does the model stand up to changes in the means of finance on the underlying financial ratios? I presume the target is basically at the end of the day, is the municipality viable or not? Can you demonstrate a positive revenue stream or at least a non-negative revenue stream after all these means of finance? That's the third question. And then fourth, just an intriguing thought that since the first slide said that you guys have been doing it for 20 years, and in some places I know in India they've been doing it for equal number of periods. It's always tempting to compare. Here it's called, the names are called FOPs, Financial Operating Plans. So it's always tempting to compare 5 years later, 10 years later, how well did the FOP really perform? And so from that point of view, have any of you looked at it, and are there been any learnings that you've had that the projections that you started off with later on down the road? I mean, there will obviously be, any good modeling will always have mess ups. So what have the mess ups been? Which side of the balance of the income statement? Has it been on the income side or the expenditure side, or where have things gone wrong in the projections? So that I'll end with this, but to conclude by saying that it's extremely useful. It enables decision making to be based on facts rather than noise, and it allows for greater transparency of decision making within a city, and of course does help external finance to move in. Thanks.
So Ian, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Marie. I'll answer these fairly quickly. First of all, how disaggregated is this? And I think what you meant, Rajivan, is geographically. And the answer is no. This type of model, MSFM particularly needs to model the complete municipality. You can model different municipalities, aggregate them outwards, but not inwards. But I think Adrian can respond because in eThekwini he spoke about tools. eThekwini has tools for actually taking this down into sub-city level, and they've been quite innovative in doing this to subdivide the city into different zones and understand demand and costs and so on, and revenue in different zones. In terms of separating into different modules, in other words, doing water, sanitation, electricity separately, yes, you could do it. And we've, for example, in Zambia, we've run this model for water and sanitation only for the Zambian water companies. So yes, you can. You can either use them all together, in other words, take all your service providers together, or you can subdivide it and run different components. So you can run it for a city doing minimal service delivery. It does break down quite a lot then if you're doing very little bits and pieces of services. I think the point, Rajivan, of accrual accounting is really important. So the figures you saw in the presentation were based on accrual accounting. In other words, the costs would have included depreciation, typical standard international accounting, and the expenditure would include depreciation, and you would get a cash surplus from the operating account. And obviously, if you don't collect the income from consumers, you're going to run you're going to come short of cash. So you can do that. There is an option in the model to put the amount of the proportion of payment on each account in there. And yes, the key thing is the means of finance. In other words, how do you balance grants versus development charges versus borrowing versus using your own internal reserves? So a classic case would be terminology would be balancing debt and equity finance, for example. And quite importantly, because South Africa has been innovating on development charges, it allows you to calculate the potential for raising funding from property developers. And lastly, yes, you're right, Rajivan, it should really be very useful to go and check back on how accurately these things did make projections. I have to confess, there hasn't been a study on that in South Africa. Adrian could probably give you a very quick assessment because he's looking at these graphs and knowing what his own current budget looks like. But we just need to remember that the model runs in real terms now as net of inflation. So it may not be that easy to just look at it from just an eyeballing quick look. So I hope that responds to your questions. Thank you.
Ian, thank you very much. Adrian, I hand over directly to you. Maybe on the first question and last questions about disaggregated geographically, and also your experience with the projections within this modeling, how you're working towards it and how it goes.
Yes, thank you very much. The way we use the MSFM, we've used it more at a strategic level and a citywide level. So we've not attempted to geographically disaggregate the model. What we find is that the distribution of revenue-generating properties as well as revenue-absorbing properties are fairly well distributed throughout the municipality. And so it hasn't really been sensible for us to say, certainly to take it down to a ward level. It hasn't really made much sense to do that. Also, the issue of accuracy around revenue uncertainty, I think what's fortunate with us as a municipality is that we've got a reasonably long trend on things like revenue collection, etc. So it's quite easy for us to project some of those moving forward. And if there's uncertainty, then what we do is we look at scenarios. So we might say if we have a 95% collection rate, and historically we've had a 95% collection rate, we might take the view that using 95% collection rate is actually not bad moving forward. But if we want to test that and see what's the sensitivity around that, then we'll change it. We'll use maybe 3 scenarios: a 90% collection rate, a 95% collection rate, and maybe a 97% collection rate. So I think in the modeling itself allows you to deal with uncertainties by building scenarios. So there is the ability to change the scenarios and see what the impact is. Insofar as means of finance are concerned, it's actually very useful to arrive at the end trying to understand what your capex need is, because that starts to then prompt you to start to look at what are your funding strategies. the model will have your conventional funding strategies in, like your grants and your debt, your borrowings, etc. But certainly it's prompted us to look at things like project financing, like tax increment financing, and developer contributions, as Ian said, is something that we're looking at quite seriously. So again, what the model does is it tells you what your need is, it tells you what the affordability is, and it starts to prompt questions around looking more flexibly or looking more broadly at how do you close the gap between the need and the supply. What we've done is we haven't evaluated the model moving forward to get a sense of whether or not the predictions were correct. In fact, we haven't found the need to do that because it gives us a very high-level strategic frame around how we deal with investment decisions. And generally, we've used scenarios where we've had levels of uncertainty, and generally we found that the guidance in the model, particularly around keeping that balance between revenue absorbing and revenue generating, adjusting service levels and trying to get a sense of how that would help you to accelerate backlogs, etc., has given us a very good frame for moving forward. But we haven't sat down and said, well, were those predictions good or not? Certainly the assumptions that we build into the model, we haven't had a problem in practice around those assumptions like revenue collection, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. It was very useful to comment and complement the answers from Ian. Two questions I want to read out. The first, if we can share the slides of the webinar how we're going to publish it. So it's going to be on our website. We're recording this webinar, so consequently also the slides are going to be available. If you have some difficulties, then just let us kindly know, and then we will also send and share it with you. So it will be for sure online. The second question is, I will just read it out. I hope it's clear. We see projections and charts are made on a host of service of city. If we want to do a plan for a new intervention, such as a women's center, how this model will be helpful for us?
I think the important point, and I think Adrian has emphasized that as well, this is a very high-level model to get a high-level long-term picture of where costs are, what level of investments are needed, and how you would fund those new assets, whether they're mostly infrastructure assets, and what that means in terms of the overall operating count on a municipality or a service provider if you're doing one service. So it isn't a project-based model. So if you take, again, going back to eThekwini, they would have other tools which they would use to prioritize projects. And the advantage of the MSFM is it creates that envelope. In other words, it tells you, look, you can afford to spend so much on water supply, so much on roads, say, for example, and so much on what we would call public services, which would include a women's centre. So it gives you an envelope, but it doesn't help you understand whether money is available for a particular project. So each project has to be assessed on its own, and you need a feasibility on each project and how the service provider, the municipality in this case, can actually fund that project. So you would generate a stream of projects which become your total sort of capital expenditure. You have to fund those projects in totality. Hopefully that's a useful response.
Yes, I think it's clear. So if the audience has some questions regarding your answer, please get back to us. And the last question which we have here, but you partially answered as well already, but I'm reading it out just to be fair as well, is how the model includes escalations and how escalations or risk are built into the investment planning price. So that means how risk are considered in the possible effects on infrastructure projects. If you mentioned it already, they're working with different scenarios. how does it cost or affect the municipal cash flow? If you, for example, talk or consider that collections fees might increase or decrease, or you mentioned as well the dependence of grants from the national governments, but sometimes the national government grants are received at much later stage during the year, or also another amount as actually projected or planned for by a city. That will be our last question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So escalation, the model works in real terms. In other words, those trends that you saw in the graph are net of inflation or net of escalation. You can actually, we've never tried it because it creates quite a lot of complications if you try and run it in nominal terms. One thing you've got to be very careful about though is when you're looking at borrowing arrangements, because generally your loans and loan repayment things tend to be more in nominal terms. So you need to be particularly careful when you're modeling what the implication is of servicing debt. And then the risk thing, I think you've essentially summarized it already, Marie, that this is really why you have a model to test different scenarios. So Adrian's also emphasized that. So you can say, what is the risk if my non-payment level goes up? In other words, the percentage of people that are paying their bills or the percentage of revenue I'm actually able to collect gets worse. What are the risks if the cost of capital goes up, for example? What are the risks if one of the biggest drivers of economic, let's call it viability on the water account would be non-revenue water? What gains can I make if I reduce my non-revenue water versus what would be the circumstances if my technical management was that bad that my non-revenue water is going up? So you can test different situations, and obviously one of the biggest things you want to test is what happens with economic growth, and what you can expect is what we found here. If you have a city that's already in the sort of middle income area like South African cities, economic growth means you can start, if you have a 5 or 6% growth, you can really start affording all those things that you need. But if your economy is really flat, your ability to raise revenue is also flat, and it becomes much harder to finance an investment program. So that would be one of the biggest tests you'd want to use this for. So in other words, the risk of economic growth being much lower than you expect. That's about it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ian, also for answering the last question. For the audience also, thank you for answering the previous questions. So with this, we would like to close from the Cities Alliance Secretariat. I think it was a very interesting conversation. Really very much, thank you very much for Ian and for the African Center for City for sharing this model, to be part of it as well as it grows, and other cities are also starting to work with this model. It seems actually a model which is also feasible to handle for local authorities. You mentioned also that's possible for smaller cities, which we are looking at secondary cities to use it, and how it improves also, of course, the decision-making process of our local government, not of the mayors only, but also of the planning officers. Yeah, thank you very much. We will be part of the future conversation to follow how this model rolls out in different countries, as Kenya you mentioned as well. And once we will have our next webinar, we will then, of course, as we did as well here, then invite our Cities Alliance members and partners to join us. So thank you very much. Have a good morning or a good afternoon, and talk to some of you quite soon.